On a storm-bruised evening in November of 1971, a man stepped into Portland International Airport carrying nothing more than a briefcase, a ticket, and a kind of calm confidence that makes people remember your face, but not your name. He told the ticket agent his name was Dan Cooper. No middle initial, no address, no hesitation. And within the next few hours, this quiet, well-dressed passenger would pull off one of the most baffling acts in American history. A crime with no body, no confirmed motive, no proven landing spot, and perhaps most frustrating to investigators, no ending. Before he vanished into the night, somewhere between Portland and Seattle, Cooper walked straight into the pages of American folklore, defying the FBI, defying the elements, and defying the limits of what one man should have been able to do. A hijacker, a ghost, a legend carved into aviation history. But here's the truth. We're not even sure he survived the jump. 50 years later, the name D.B. Cooper still hovers over America like a shadow nobody can fully trace. It has inspired treasure hunters, copycats, FBI task forces, Hollywood productions, and an entire generation of amateur sleuths trying to solve a mystery built at 10,000 feet in the freezing air. Tonight, we go back to the very beginning, to the man in the black tie, the man with the dark sunglasses, the man who ordered bourbon and soda before handing a flight attendant a letter that would change the course of aviation forever. This is not just a story of a hijacking. It is the story of the only unsolved skyjacking in American history, and the man bold enough to attempt it. Before we open the cabin door and step inside Flight 305, take a second to support this channel. If you enjoy deep-dive true crime documentaries told with care, accuracy, and atmosphere, hit that subscribe button now and turn on notifications. It helps us create more long-form investigations like this one. And trust me, tonight's mystery is one you do not want to miss. November 24th, 1971. It was the day before Thanksgiving, one of the busiest travel days of the year. People were rushing home, airports were overflowing with families, and airlines were working double shifts to keep up with the holiday surge. At a small ticket counter inside Portland International Airport, a well-mannered man in his mid-40s stepped forward. He wore a black business suit, a white shirt, a slim black tie, and a raincoat draped neatly over his arm. His voice was calm, his movements controlled. There was nothing about him that raised suspicion. He paid cash for his ticket, a one-way flight to Seattle. Northwest Orient Airlines, Flight 305. The clerk later said he seemed pleasant and polite, the kind of customer you barely remember after a long shift, except, of course, for the fact that the world would soon be repeating his name for decades. Cooper proceeded to the airport without a hint of nerves. He didn't check a bag. The briefcase stayed close to his side at all times. Witnesses said he didn't look rushed or distracted or unusual. If anything, he looked like a man who'd taken this route dozens of times before. At 2:45 p.m., Cooper walked across the jet bridge and stepped onto Flight 305, a Boeing 727 with 3 rear engines and a staircase underneath the tail, a feature that, at the time, almost nobody gave a second thought. But Cooper did. He found his seat, 18C, a seat with a perfect view of the wing, a seat close to the rear staircase. And as the plane prepared for takeoff, the quiet man in the black tie ordered something simple, bourbon and soda. Nobody knew it then, but every second that followed was part of a plan crafted with extraordinary precision. At 3:02 p.m., the cabin doors closed. The flight to Seattle was short, barely 30 minutes in the air. Routine, forgettable, the kind of flight where most passengers never even unbuckle their seatbelts. But for one person on board, every second was calculated. As Flight 305 lifted off the runway and climbed into the gray November sky, Cooper watched calmly from his seat. He didn't fidget. He didn't look around nervously. In fact, according to passengers seated nearby, he seemed remarkably relaxed, almost as if he wasn't just prepared for what was coming, but familiar with it. Now, flight attendants in 1971 operated differently than they do today. Hijackings, strangely enough, were not rare. It was the era before metal detectors, before the era of strict baggage checks, before the age of terrorism and sealed cockpit doors. At that time, the act of hijacking was often political theater, not violence. Planes were frequently diverted to Cuba by frustrated men waving unloaded pistols or empty threats. Nobody imagined what this man was about to do. Around 3:10 p.m., Flight attendant Florence Schaffner walked down the aisle to check on passengers, a routine pass. When she approached seat 18C, Cooper didn't look up. He simply handed her a white envelope, small, folded cleanly once. She assumed, naturally, it was a phone number. Flight attendants were used to unwanted attention from businessmen traveling alone. Without slowing her stride, she slipped the note into her pocket and continued walking. She didn't read it. She didn't think twice. She never even looked back. Cooper waited a few seconds, then leaned slightly forward. His voice was low, steady and unmistakably serious. "Miss, you'd better read that note. I have a bomb." Those 4 words changed the entire atmosphere on board Flight 305. Quietly, invisibly, and yet the rest of the passengers had no idea anything was happening. Schaffner stopped, turned, met his eyes. Cooper lifted the briefcase just slightly, enough for her to understand this was no joke. She opened the note. It was written neatly, in all capital letters. Inside was a message that would launch one of the largest manhunts in American history. "I have a bomb in my briefcase. I want you to sit next to me." No theatrics. No threats beyond those 2 sentences. Just a message delivered with the confidence of a man who fully believed he was in control. Florence Schaffner sat down beside him, her heart racing, her mind calculating every protocol she'd ever been trained for. But nothing in her training covered this specific moment. Cooper leaned toward her and quietly opened the case. Inside, she later told investigators, were 8 red cylinders, a battery, and wires, neatly arranged, almost surgical in appearance. Whether it was real or a bluff didn't matter. It was convincing enough. And then, completely composed, Cooper began to speak. Cooper didn't raise his voice. He didn't panic. He didn't rush. Instead, he listed his demands with the politeness of a man ordering lunch. $200,000 in cash. For parachutes, 2 primary, 2 reserve. A fuel truck ready in Seattle to refuel the aircraft. Not negotiable. Not open for discussion. He insisted all of these would be delivered before the plane could take off again after landing in Seattle. And one more thing. He wanted the plane to stay in the air until everything was ready on the ground. A hijacker who didn't want to go to Cuba, didn't want political asylum, didn't want a manifesto broadcast to the world. He wanted money, parachutes, and a plane configured for a second flight. This was no ordinary hijacking. This was a military-style operation. The flight attendant, still attempting to keep her voice steady, asked Cooper why he wanted 2 sets of parachutes. His answer was chilling in its simplicity. To prevent sabotage. It told investigators something important decades later. Cooper anticipated that the FBI might hand him faulty equipment. and he had a strategy to counter it. This wasn't a man acting impulsively. This was a man who understood aviation, understood skydiving, and understood human response under pressure. Within minutes, Schaffner relayed the demands to the cockpit. Captain William Scott, a veteran pilot with more than 8,000 flight hours, listened carefully. In 1971, pilots were trained to comply with hijackers, keep them calm, keep the passengers safe, and get everyone on the ground alive. Scott radioed the airline. The airline notified the FBI. The FBI notified Washington. A hijacking was officially in progress. But inside the cabin, Cooper remained composed. He ordered another bourbon and soda. He paid for it, politely, and when Schaffner asked why he was doing this, he simply smiled. A passenger later said they heard him say, quietly, "I don't have a grudge against your airline. I just have a job to do." The news traveled fast, faster than the aircraft itself. Within minutes, Northwest Orient's headquarters had launched an emergency protocol. The FBI mobilized their Seattle field office, and agents were racing toward Seattle-Tacoma Airport to prepare for something the aviation world had never dealt with before. But on Flight 305, you wouldn't have known any of that. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was strangely calm. No panic, no raised voices. Most passengers thought the plane was experiencing routine turbulence or minor delays. They continued reading their newspapers, sipping their drinks, chatting quietly, entirely unaware that a man in seat 18C had just set off a national security crisis. Florence Schaffner stayed seated beside Cooper, her composure remarkable. Cooper, almost unervingly, treated her with respect. He wasn't impatient. He wasn't aggressive. If anything, he behaved like a businessman negotiating terms. He spoke only when necessary. He kept his tone even. At one point, he calmly instructed, "You might want to tell the pilot to fly slow. We're in no hurry." The captain complied. The plane remained in holding patterns over the Pacific Northwest, while the FBI scrambled to meet his demands. In Seattle, FBI agents rallied inside a command center set up directly at Seattle-Tacoma Airport. They had no profile on the suspect, no motive, no idea whether the bomb was real, and no time to formulate a strategy beyond one principle. Cooperate now. Catch him later. The money was assembled urgently from several local banks. 20,000 $10 bills. Each bill was photographed, documented, and recorded. The FBI knew the odds of catching Cooper in the moment were slim. But if he survived his escape, the money trail could eventually lead them back to him. The parachutes were a problem. The first set the FBI sourced were military chutes, sturdy but outdated. Cooper rejected those immediately. He demanded civilian sport parachutes, the kind used by recreational skydivers. Why? Because they allowed more control, more maneuverability, more precision. The FBI had no choice but to comply. This detail would haunt investigators for decades. A man who doesn't want military chutes. A man who understands the difference. A man who knows how to jump from a Boeing 727 at night. They weren't dealing with an amateur. Back in the sky above Washington, the crew maintained a perfect facade. They told passengers there was a minor mechanical issue, and they'd need to remain in the air a little longer before landing. One passenger later said she remembered thinking, they must be waiting for a gate to open. No one suspected the truth. The flight attendants continued serving drinks. A mother bounced her infant on her lap. A businessman flipped through a magazine. Cooper sat quietly, hands folded, briefcase at his feet. When Schaffner asked if he had a grudge or specific target, he replied, I don't care about any of that. I just want the money and the parachutes when we land. Then he offered her his own cigarette. He wasn't angry. He wasn't unhinged. He wasn't ranting. He was composed in a way investigators later described as cold professionalism. Finally, after nearly 2 tension-filled hours in the air, the cockpit received confirmation. The money was ready. The parachutes were ready. Fuel trucks were standing by. FBI agents were positioned discreetly around the airport, instructed not to engage Cooper directly. At Cooper's request, the cabin lights were dimmed for landing. The shades were drawn down. The aisles remained clear. Cooper wanted no snipers, no sudden movements, no surprises. At 5:46 p.m., Flight 305 began descending toward Seattle-Tacoma Airport. The passengers remained blissfully unaware. Florence Schaffner, seated next to a hijacker with a supposed bomb, later said, "He never seemed nervous. If anything, he looked prepared." And that was what unsettled investigators the most. A hijacker who behaves predictably is manageable. A hijacker who behaves erratically is dangerous. But a hijacker who behaves professionally, that's something else entirely. At 5:46 p.m., Flight 305 touched down at Seattle-Tacoma Airport under dim cabin lighting and absolute silence among the crew. Cooper had given very specific instructions. All shades must remain down. Passengers must not see anything outside. No armed personnel within immediate view. No sudden movements. No tricks. Captain Scott taxied the 727 to a remote, isolated section of the runway, far from terminals or other aircraft. A fuel truck rolled toward the plane slowly, guided under FBI instructions to appear as routine as possible. Inside the cabin, Cooper remained calm. He reminded Florence Schaffner to sit still and to make sure the cockpit stayed in constant communication with him through the intercom. There was no chaos, no shouting, just a man who seemed to have rehearsed this moment hundreds of times. Then came the strange part. Cooper insisted the passengers leave first, before the money or parachutes were delivered. And still, he wanted no one to know what was happening. So the crew followed through with the cover story. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We've had a minor mechanical issue. We'll be disembarking shortly." The passengers filed out slowly, the way people do after a short domestic flight. Cooper watched silently as each one passed. He never stood, never looked directly at them, never spoke. Not a single passenger suspected the truth. Some even joked years later. "I didn't realize until the FBI knocked on my door." By 7 p.m., the last passenger stepped off the aircraft. The hijacking was now a sealed, controlled environment, just Cooper and the crew. Outside, an FBI agent placed a large canvas bank bag on the stairs of the aircraft. An airline operations manager retrieved it and carried it inside, exactly as Cooper had demanded. The money was heavy, nearly 22 pounds of tightly banded cash, each bill documented. Cooper didn't rush. He unzipped the bag slightly, inspected the contents, and nodded with approval. Next came the 4 parachutes. Cooper examined them with familiarity, as if he knew exactly what he was looking for. He picked 2 and set them aside. The other 2 he inspected more carefully. One of them didn't meet his standards. He pushed it away without explanation. Then he issued new instructions. Cooper told the crew they were going to take off again, but this time their flight plan would change dramatically. Here were the new demands. The plane would fly south toward Mexico City. It would maintain a low altitude, 10,000 feet. It would fly with landing gear down. It would keep the cabin unpressurized. It would fly with the rear staircase lowered. These instructions stunned the pilots. Flying low with landing gear down burns enormous amounts of fuel. Mexico City at that altitude was nearly impossible. They told Cooper the plane simply couldn't make that distance. Cooper didn't argue. Instead, he offered an alternative. We'll go to Reno to refuel. The plan was back on track. The FBI, listening from the ground, knew exactly what that meant. He planned to jump somewhere between Seattle and Reno. And he wanted that staircase down mid-flight because he intended to leave the aircraft the same mysterious way he came in, quietly, invisibly, and without being traced. Cooper allowed only a skeleton crew to stay on board. Captain William Scott, First Officer Bob Radizak, Flight Engineer H.E. Anderson, Flight Attendant Tina Mucklow. He ordered the rest off the plane, including Florence Schaffner. Before she exited, Cooper quietly said, "Thank you. You were very calm." It was the last time she or anyone ever spoke to him face to face. By now, the story had leaked to the public. News cameras crowded the edges of the runway. Reporters whispered details, unsure what was true. Speculation circled like the cold wind sweeping across the tarmac. America was witnessing the birth of one of its greatest unsolved mysteries. But at this moment, only the crew trapped inside the plane knew how strange and calculated this hijacker truly was. Inside that 727, just miles away from hundreds of flashing news cameras, D.B. Cooper sat calmly in seat 18C, tying knots in the parachute cords, checking the straps on the money bag, and preparing himself for the next phase of a plan no one else understood. He looked, according to the crew, confident, not reckless, not anxious, just ready. By 7:40 p.m., Flight 305 was airborne again. The Boeing 727 rolled down the runway, engines roaring, lights glinting off its polished fuselage. Seattle's night skyline receded, leaving Cooper, the crew, and the meticulously prepared ransom deep inside a plane that had become a cocoon of tension and control. The rear staircase, an unusual feature of the 727, was lowered as requested. It would become the man's escape route, the exit into legend. The pilots followed Cooper's instructions precisely. Altitude 10,000 feet, unpressurized cabin, landing gear down. Every command met with the eerie calm of a man who knew exactly what he wanted and exactly how to get it. Cooper made no small talk. He didn't gloat. He didn't taunt. Instead, he meticulously arranged his parachute, checking every strap, every buckle, every fold of fabric. The money bag rested beside him. His briefcase, once containing a bomb, now inert but terrifying in its implication, sat carefully at his feet. Minutes passed. The cabin lights dimmed further. The engines hummed a steady cadence, masking the faint rustle of parachute fabric. The crew maintained radio contact with air traffic control, tension palpable in every word exchanged. Cooper spoke only twice. "Prepare the rear stairs. We'll be jumping soon." Flight Engineer H.E. Anderson recalled later. He wasn't frantic or scared. He seemed methodical, like someone who'd done this before, or at least imagined it countless times. The pilots prepared for turbulence. The wind whipped around the tail. The night was black, the weather overcast, the temperature dropping sharply as the aircraft passed into the upper reaches of the Washington sky. And then, at some point between 7:40 and 8 p.m., history happened. D.B. Cooper stood. He adjusted his chute one final time. The rear door opened. The night air howled. The Boeing 727 shuddered. The crew didn't see him fall. They didn't hear a scream. They didn't witness the moment. Only one thing remained: a sudden absence, a hole in the reality of the flight, and a plane continuing to fly southward, lighter by 22 pounds of cash and a man who disappeared into the darkness. The crew would later describe the atmosphere as surreal. Captain Scott radioed the airline. Passenger gone. All is calm. But nothing was calm. The FBI would soon arrive. The press would swarm. And an entire nation would be left asking the same question. Where did he go? Did he survive? Was it planned perfectly, or was it luck? Authorities scoured the skies immediately. Search planes, helicopters, and boats combed miles of forest, river, and farmland. Bloodhounds tracked the area where Cooper might have landed. Yet, in the darkness, nothing, no body, no parachute, no trace beyond the wind and cold November air. Back at Seattle-Tacoma, the FBI began the painstaking investigation, examining the aircraft, interviewing the crew, documenting the empty money bag, tracking the serial numbers of the ransom bills. They knew only one thing. Cooper had vanished with $200,000 in cash, the equivalent of over $1.5 million today. And he had vanished cleanly, leaving behind only questions and theories. For decades, people would hunt for Cooper's identity. Was he a military veteran? A pilot? A parachutist? A con man? Was he alive or dead? Every lead, every clue, every reported sighting became part of a sprawling legend. Tonight, we follow the trail. We examine the man, the myth, the method, and the money. We'll revisit the FBI files, interview witnesses, analyze every detail, from the Portland airport to the Pacific Northwest forest. And we'll ask the question that has haunted America for half a century. Who was D.B. Cooper, and did he really get away with it? November 25th, 1971. The morning after Flight 305 vanished into the night sky, the FBI Seattle field office was in chaos, but not the frantic, disorganized kind you might imagine. Every agent understood the stakes. A man had hijacked an aircraft, demanded a massive ransom, and disappeared without a trace into the forests of the Pacific Northwest. This was uncharted territory. There was no precedent for a hijacker executing such a precise airborne escape. No fingerprints, no video surveillance, no one who could identify him. And yet, one thing was certain: the suspect was still out there. FBI agents began by interviewing the crew. Captain William Scott, First Officer Bob Radizak, Flight Engineer H.E. Anderson, and Flight Attendant Tina Mucklow provided detailed accounts of Cooper's movements, his demeanor, and his demands. Each detail, however small, was painstakingly documented. The agents asked themselves, how could someone survive a jump from 10,000 feet at night into the freezing air over heavily forested terrain? How could he anticipate every countermeasure and still remain calm and methodical? And most importantly, why did he do it? The FBI quickly realized they were chasing a criminal who was not only meticulous, but strategic. Investigators immediately returned to Portland International Airport. They examined a ticket Cooper had purchased under the name Dan Cooper, double-checking every detail. Paid in cash, no paper trail. No identification provided. One-way ticket only. They checked camera footage. Although in 1971, security cameras were crude and limited. Witnesses described a well-dressed, composed man, mid-40s, quiet, seemingly unremarkable. Yet, every observation was consistent. Cooper was calculated, calm, and capable. FBI profilers began sketching a preliminary psychological profile. Likely male, between 35 to 45, knowledgeable in aviation and parachuting, physically fit. He would need to survive a jump with heavy cash and limited gear, confident, perhaps overconfident, in his own planning. The ransom money became the FBI's first tangible lead, $200,000 in $20 bills, bundled in canvas bags. Serial numbers meticulously recorded. Every bill was traceable, theoretically giving the FBI a chance to catch Cooper if he ever tried to spend it. Yet, over the coming decades, only a handful of bills surfaced. The first clue emerged in 1980, nearly a decade later, when $5,800 in $20 bills washed up along the Columbia River, partially buried in sand. Experts analyzed the weather, river currents, and the physical condition of the bills. Theories emerged. Did Cooper die mid-jump? Did he stash the money intentionally? Or was it an accidental loss? An early clue into a meticulously planned disappearance? For now, though, the FBI's task was immediate. Find him before he disappears into the night for good. Witness accounts became critical. Flight attendants, ground crew, and even casual airport observers were re-interviewed repeatedly. Some passengers remembered Cooper as polite and calm. Airline staff noted he had a certain confidence that suggested experience with aircraft. One pilot suggested Cooper may have had military or law enforcement training due to the methodical nature of his demands. The FBI also reached out to parachuting clubs, skydiving instructors, and aviation experts. No reports matched Cooper's description. No record of training flights, jumps, or unusual behavior. It was as if he had vanished from the grid completely. The FBI's initial investigation quickly ballooned into one of the largest manhunts in American history. Agents pored over hundreds of tips, scrutinized thousands of names, and examined potential suspects across the United States and even Canada. Yet for every lead, there seemed to be 10 dead ends. One early suspect was Richard McCoy, a former Army paratrooper who later executed a nearly identical hijacking in 1972. His skill set matched Cooper's: parachuting, aviation knowledge, and a calm, methodical demeanor, but he had an airtight alibi for the 1971 hijacking. Another lead came from a man known only as William Smith, who claimed he had worked in Seattle's shipping industry and had access to parachutes. Investigators traced him, interviewed his acquaintances, and checked his military records. Nothing linked him to Flight 305. The FBI even considered that Cooper may have been a disgruntled airline employee, someone who knew the ins and outs of the aircraft and the security gaps. But payroll records, employment histories, and flight logs produced no credible connections. Each false lead increased the mythos of D.B. Cooper. Every agent involved knew something unusual was happening. This was not a random crime of opportunity. It was the act of a man who had calculated every detail and vanished in a way the authorities could not anticipate. The FBI's behavioral analysts began building a detailed profile. Age and gender. Male, likely 35 to 45, with physical capability for a high-altitude parachute jump. Personality. Calm under pressure, highly intelligent, meticulous planner, possibly socially isolated but disciplined. Skills. Experience in aviation and parachuting. Knowledge of navigation and survival tactics. Motivation. Primarily financial. No political agenda. No known vendettas. These profiles were circulated nationwide, but even with the full FBI apparatus, Cooper remained invisible. No fingerprints. No photograph. No arrest. No confession. Every failed lead only amplified his legend. He became a symbol of the perfect crime, the man who seemed to exist between reality and myth. By December 1971, the media had fully caught on. Newspapers across the nation ran front-page stories. The man who jumped from a plane and disappeared. D.B. Cooper, America's elusive sky pirate. The public was fascinated. Some admired him, framing him as a modern-day Robin Hood, stealing money without harming anyone. Others condemned him as a dangerous criminal who could have killed himself or innocent passengers. Collectors and hobbyists began tracking the ransom money. Parachuting clubs debated the feasibility of his jump. Students of aviation speculated endlessly. Could someone really survive a night jump with that much cash in sub-zero temperatures? And through it all, Cooper's legend grew, untouchable, unseen, and untold. 9 years after D.B. Cooper vanished into the night, the mystery seemed to have reached a dead end. The FBI had interviewed hundreds of suspects, examined countless leads, and chased thousands of tips across North America. And then, in 1980, something unexpected emerged. A young boy, digging a fire pit along the Columbia River near Vancouver, Washington, uncovered $5,800 in $20 bills. The bills were partially buried in the sand, sun-bleached, and carefully bundled, an unmistakable remnant of the ransom money. It was the first tangible clue since that fateful November night in 1971. The discovery electrified investigators. Had Cooper survived his jump? Had he buried part of the ransom as a contingency? Or had the money simply been lost in the wind, a casualty of the treacherous November weather? Experts quickly analyzed the bills. They matched the serial numbers of the ransom money. The physical condition suggested years exposed to the elements, not freshly handled. There was no definitive evidence of who placed them there or when. The Columbia River find gave birth to countless theories. Survival theory. Cooper had landed safely, stashed some of the money, and disappeared forever. Death theory. Cooper didn't survive the jump, and the wind, rain, and river carried the bills to the shore. Partial theft theory. Cooper may have buried some of the money intentionally, planning to retrieve it later. Copycat or planning theory. Some speculated the money had been placed years later to throw off investigators. None of these theories could be proven, and none could be dismissed. The FBI remained cautious. The money discovery fueled the investigation, but also deepened the enigma. It became clear that D.B. Cooper was not just a criminal. He was a legend shaped by his absence, his planning, and the gaps left behind. In the years following Columbia River discovery, the FBI ramped up its investigation with new tools and renewed vigor. Advances in forensic science, criminal profiling, and digital databases allowed agents to revisit every lead. Hundreds of suspects were examined in detail. Former military paratroopers who had the necessary skills. Airline employees with intimate knowledge of 727 aircraft. Local criminals with access to parachutes or aviation gear. Ordinary citizens who might have had the audacity and the cunning to pull off such a meticulously planned heist. Each suspect was meticulously vetted. Fingerprints, handwriting samples, alibis, and personal histories were compared against Cooper's profile. Every potential match led only to dead ends. Some claimed responsibility, but none could prove it. Some were suspected, but investigation cleared them. Some vanished into obscurity, leaving only speculation and unanswered questions. Even today, more than 5 decades later, the FBI officially classifies the D.B. Cooper case as unsolved. It is the only unsolved skyjacking in American history. A man who leapt into legend and disappeared without a trace. D.B. Cooper remains a symbol of mystery, audacity, and human curiosity. He has inspired true crime enthusiasts and amateur sleuths. Movies, books, and documentaries. Countless theories about the limits of human cunning and planning. But beyond the legend, the case reminds us of one universal truth. Some mysteries resist being solved, leaving only the story and the questions for generations to ponder. If you've been captivated by the daring escape, the unanswered questions, and the meticulous planning of D.B. Cooper, here's what you can do. Subscribe now to join us for deep dive documentaries that explore the most fascinating true crime stories in history. Hit the notification bell to never miss an investigation. And in the comments below, tell us, do you think D.B. Cooper survived the jump, or was a Columbia River find proof that he met his fate that night? Your theories might just inspire our next documentary, because some legends, like Cooper's, are best explored together.